I thought I was coming last. There are really four things I want to talk about, but before I do so, I just want to introduce myself in the sense that I spent 11 years working in the Irish Embassy in London. 5 of those years were from 1977 to 1982, when I was the person in the embassy dealing with the political parties and with the British press. That was for the murder of Lord Mountbatten, the murder of Eirene Neve, who was a friend of mine, the hunger strikes and the Falklands. And then I went back in 2001 and I was there for 6 years as ambassador. And the relationship had changed totally. We'd gone from living in enemy territory to living in a country where the two governments were working in the closest possible way with respect and trust for each other to try and deal with the situation of Northern Ireland. So it was a very different landscape. And let me say, I don't think we're going back to where we were in the 70s and the 80s, thank God. But I think we could very easily be going back to a place of great difficulty in the relationship between London and Dublin. Because that improved relationship between London and Dublin happened while we were both members of the EU, while we were both trying to deal with common problems in the EU, and not as we had been for the previous 700 or 800 years, a very large country dealing with a very small country. It's not only England and Ireland, it's the United States and Canada, it's Russia and Ukraine, it's France and Algeria. The bilateral relations between a large country and its small neighbour can always be difficult. But that difficult history of ours between London and Dublin, that difficult history disappeared effectively, but it disappeared when we were both within the European Union. And I really have fears that if a hard Brexit occurs, and I think a hard Brexit will occur, I really have fears for the future. So I'm just going to talk about, very briefly, 4 things. Firstly, why did the English vote the way they did? What do I think will happen? What should we do to deal with what might happen or to prepare for what might happen? And then lastly, I just want to say a few words about Northern Ireland and about talking about realities and not cloud cuckoo land. Firstly, why did it happen? Well, those of you who have followed Britain in the European Union over the last 40 years will know that it was always a peculiar relationship. It was a very special relationship. We in the Institute for International and European Affairs, we published a book about 2.5 years ago, before the decision to have a referendum was taking place, to say that there was a special relationship between Britain and the UK, between the UK and the EU, and that something needed to be done within the EU to provide for a special status for Britain, which would deal with this issue for the next generation. That didn't happen. David Cameron did get a deal. He didn't sell it. I fully agree with the comment in the London Review of Books that he's the worst British Prime Minister since Lord North lost the colonies. He didn't sell it. He had a deal which included certain controls on immigration, but it didn't sell. And I think the reason for it, why it didn't sell, is within the English psyche. If you take London out of the mix, and take Scotland out of the mix, and take Northern Ireland out of the mix, there was a very solid majority of English and perhaps Welsh in favour of leaving the EU. I think that's the reality in England. They don't like the Europeans. And it goes back, it's not talked about very much, but it's deep in the psyche, just the same as the famine is deep in our psyche. It goes back to the Reformation under the Tudors, when they cut themselves off from continental Europe, and they see, in one way or another, they see continental Europe as being ruled from Rome. That's very, very deep in the English psyche, and it's something you should never forget. So I think this is why we had a referendum. I think this is why they voted no, and I think this is why Mrs May very quickly and Jeremy Corbyn very quickly went for effectively a hard Brexit. The details of that hard Brexit were not discussed in any great detail during the course of the referendum campaign. But very shortly, Mrs May had said, there will be controls on immigration from the EU, we're out of the single market, we're out of the customs union, and there'll be no role for the European Court of Justice. Jeremy Corbyn is practically on the same page. Now, if this Brexit happens, that they are out of the customs union and that there is no role for the European Court of Justice, and I think that's where we're headed, because I think that is the authentic England. If that's where we're headed, then we are in for very big difficulties in our state and on this island. And don't underestimate them. I really do think that we're in for a split. We're in for very difficult negotiations. Brendan Halligan reckons there's only 50% or maybe less than 50% of reaching agreement. And I don't disagree with them very much at all. I think it's going to be very difficult, and I think it's very uncertain. So are we prepared for this? Is our state prepared for this? What can we do? Well, I have to join with people yesterday who recognised the extraordinarily fine job that's been done by the Irish administration and the Irish government in having the problems on the border and the problems between the two islands up there as one of the three issues which are being addressed in the first instance in these negotiations. The two chiefs of staff, Michel Barnier's chief of staff and David Davy's chief of staff, the two of them are meeting today to work on the Northern Ireland issue. Now, we've heard a lot, I'll come back to it, we've heard a lot about having a frictionless border and so on. I do not see how, if the British pull out of the customs union and if there are controls on immigration, there can be anything but a border between the Republic of Ireland and the United Kingdom. But I think we did very well in the initial negotiations. The Irish are very good at working in Brussels. And I agree completely with what Rory Quinn said last night about the need for us now to build up alliances. Our major ally in the European Union up until now was the United Kingdom. We shared many common positions with the United Kingdom, not least in the whole question of legal affairs and the common law. That has to change. As Rory said, we need to build up a relationship with Denmark, with the Netherlands, with Portugal, with the Benelux, and I would also argue very strongly with the Nordics and the Baltics. And if there are common interests here, and at the same time, we really need to beef up our contacts with the two capitals that will drive this whole thing forward, and that's Berlin and Paris. And I'm glad to see that they are actually increasing the diplomatic representation in those two capitals. It tells you something about Irish endeavour. When the first telephone call that Macron took on the first round of the election was from Enda Kenny. And it tells you something when our new Taoiseach, Leo Varadkar, has already met Macron. That's what we need to do. We need to talk to the people where the power lies, and I think we're very good at it. But we need to think, as Brendan Halligan said yesterday, we need to think of some changes that might take place in this country, which would persuade the Europeans that we're actually on their side and not on the side of the British, and particularly, as regards the multinationals, not on the side of the Americans. I do think, and I agree with Brendan, that we need to think about Schengen. We need to think about the common travel area. I do think we have to start thinking about defence, not NATO. Nobody's asking us to join NATO. But we do need to start thinking about how we can contribute. And I'm glad to see that the government and the Dáil took decisions recently about a greater role for our Navy in the Mediterranean in dealing with the migrants. That's the way we need to go, and that's what we need to think about, in my view. There seems to me to be one particular area, or related areas, where not an awful lot of thinking is taking place, and not an awful lot of preparation is taking place, and that's in the area of transportation. A huge amount of the goods imported into this country and exported from this country, whether to the United Kingdom or, more importantly, to Northern Europe, go through the port of Larne and the port of Belfast, and then go onwards across Britain to the Netherlands or to France or to Belgium. If a customs union comes in, there'll be a huge effect on that trade. And I think now is the time, as Alan Duke said yesterday, when we really need to start thinking, do we need to build up our capacity to handle transport in Cork, for example, or in Rosslare? Do we need, for example, a ferry from Rosslare to Spain, perhaps, to import the fruit and vegetables that come into this country from Spain and the fish that go from here to Spain? When I was in London, going back maybe 13, 14 years ago, the British were giving very serious consideration to the possibility of introducing a levy on non-British trucks using British roads. Now, this has happened before. Many of you will remember the levy on trucks going through Austria. I wouldn't rule out the possibility that they would introduce a levy. So we really have to give attention as a state to how we'll handle these things, and we need to be prepared if the British fall off the cliff in 18 months' time. There's another area dealing with transportation that we haven't thought about at all, and that's the manner in which the multiples operate in this country. The German multiples, Lidl and Aldi, the British multiples, Tesco and Marks and Sparks, and the Irish multiples, Dunn's and Superquinn. All of them have operations north and south. All of them have operations east and west. The trucks which fill up the Tesco stores, those trucks are filled in the UK. Now, a lot of the goods in those trucks actually come from here. But there is a real problem with this supply chain should a hard border be introduced. And I think we need to look at it. Now, just to put this in the context of what Joe asked me to talk about, there is certainly, in my view, the capacity in government departments to handle most of these problems. At the senior levels, most of the civil servants are of very fine quality, and they have honed their skills over 40 plus years in the European Union. Taoiseach's department, finance, foreign affairs, so on, they're very good. There are some departments that are very good departments, but they don't actually have a sufficient capacity to do what will be necessary. A primary one being the Department of Justice, because a lot of the legislative matters that were handled in Brussels and so on, a lot of the hard work on the common law was actually done in Britain. And Justice got a fairly easy ride. There are problems. Justice is a very good department, but there are problems in justice just with capacity. I think our real problem is political capacity. We have elected people to Parliament who, whatever the shape, and I think the vast majority of them are very good people, they find it very difficult to make decisions. because of the manner in which they were elected. There are large numbers of independents, which makes it difficult. But we also have a system whereby far too much senior civil service time is spent on things like parliamentary questions, when civil servants should be doing real work and spending their time resolving problems. They're spending their time writing answers to parliamentary questions. I heard the number of parliamentary questions that were answered in the last 2 days of the last Dáil. I don't know exactly, I've forgotten what they were, Pat, but they were huge.
It was a lot.
It's a waste of time. It's a waste of civil service time. So I think there are reforms that can be carried out, but the basic building blocks are there. We basically have a very good civil service, and we basically, frankly, have a very good political system. But we just have to hone it so that decisions can be taken properly and so that people can spend their time resolving problems and, more importantly, with Brexit, anticipating the problems that might occur should there be a hard Brexit. I said I'd just say a little bit about Northern Ireland, largely because I spent most of my life on it. I really am fearful about the future. The two communities in Northern Ireland are much further apart now than they have been for many years. The DUP are talking to DUP supporters. Sinn Féin are talking to Sinn Féin supporters. And the sort of vision that you got from the political leadership of Martin McGuinness and Ian Paisley and Peter Robinson, people who had gone through the negotiations, unlike the current leadership, that sort of leadership seems to me to be missing. The sort of people who could reach out to the other community. The Northern Ireland problem was resolved by the two governments. The two governments drove it. It was driven from London and Dublin. We were able to do business with Mrs. Thatcher. We were able to do business with John Major. We were able to do business with Tony Blair and Gordon Brown. If we had a real problem in the morning in Northern Ireland, I don't know who we could do business with. During the course of the referendum campaign, Northern Ireland and the Republic of Ireland did not figure. Craig Oliver, who was in charge of the referendum campaign in Number 10, and who kept a diary, and is himself a very fine journalist, he wrote a book called Unleashing Demons about the campaign. There is not a mention in the book, which is a record of the campaign, not a mention in the book, not one, of Ireland and not one of Northern Ireland. There were some harsh words said last night here about what Ireland really means in London. I wouldn't use the words, but I agree with the sentiment. The English look after themselves, just like we look after ourselves. We shouldn't expect the English to look after us. They won't. We need to look after ourselves. And it worries me because that attention to Northern Ireland, which took place within the European framework, will in the future be without the European framework. And I really am fearful about the lack of capacity in the political parties in Northern Ireland to do a deal for all the people of Northern Ireland. I'll finish on a separate note, but also about Northern Ireland. I've heard lots of talks from politicians about a frictionless border, about a seamless border, about no border. It's rubbish. If Mrs. May achieves what she wants, and I think what she wants is what the English people want, if she achieves a break from the customs union, which enables her to trade in whatever way she wants, with whoever she wants, and if she imposes restrictions on immigration from the EU, if she does that, and we remain in the EU, then there will be a border, and it won't be frictionless. Whether it's the border between the south and the north, which I think is most likely, or whether it's a border down the Irish Sea. So I think really we need to, using an American phrase, we need to get real. We need to look at the real problems which are facing us. We most certainly can resolve them. We've been in tougher places. It can be resolved, but we need to put our minds together to resolve it. Thank you.